The Science of Society Major Principles of Marxism by Noah Khrachvik.
Just as Darwin discovered the laws of development in organic nature, so Marx discovered the laws of development in human society.
Frederick Engels.
What Engels said.
William Z. Foster. There is so much confusion these days. We are coming out of an era of confusion, of purposeful distortion, of the establishment and arms of the state using its sophisticated propaganda machine to mislead us in so many ways as to what our interests are, that even once we begin understanding that it is the system itself that is the problem, we are immediately confronted with more distortions designed to redirect any potential revolutionary energy away from ever being a threat to the ruling class. This includes confusing us over what basic terminology is. Recently, I've been clarifying old Marxist terms that have been distorted over the years on social media. Search for the hashtag #Marxist terminology if you're interested. And this phenomenon is why I wrote this essay. I mean, even the word Marxism is a mystery these days. So let's begin very simply. Marxism is a science. That's right, you read that correctly. The words haven't melted into each other and you aren't having an aneurysm. Marxism is a science. Or more precisely, Marxism is a social science. Or even more precisely, Marxism is the social science. The science that shows how unscientific liberal social sciences are by genuinely explaining how things happen in society and why. But how can this be, I hear you ask from across time and space? It seems so weird. Marxism can't be a science. Science is when nerdy-looking people in lab coats and goggles do experiments with test tubes, and then smoke comes out of the test tubes. And sometimes, when it's really funny science, the science will blow up in their face and it'll be all singed for a minute before it goes back to normal. Or if it's a duck doing the science, maybe his bill will get turned around. That's science, right? And that's certainly not what Marxism is. Well, no. Just no. All science developed through analyzing what is, thinking about the world around us, and creating and adding to bodies of knowledge that can explain the operation of general laws, and boy howdy. Marxism fits this description like a glove, despite all of the metrics various ideologically motivated intellectuals have come up with in order to try to dispel the notion. In fact, Marx himself viewed things this way, and it has only been added to and improved upon over time. Entire countries have been founded on the discoveries Marx made, and today these discoveries are leading the world into a new era. So what makes it a science, then? It's all well and good to make declarations about what is and isn't science, but if we don't explain why, how this science developed, well, then it just isn't very helpful. We need to know what the component parts of Marxism are and how they came to be in order to judge for ourselves what exactly it is. We wouldn't call something a cheeseburger if we didn't first open up the bun and make sure the components of a cheeseburger, one burger, check, one cheese, check, were there first, would we? So let's give the same courtesy to Marxism that we give our various lunch and barbecue foods. William Z. Foster, founding member of the Communist Party USA and heroic labor leader of the early to mid-1900s, wrote one of the best histories of Marxism and Marxists to date towards the end of his life, The History of the Three Internationals. In this seminal work, he opens by describing the history of the pre-Marxist labor movement, culminating in an essay that describes the real birth of socialism as we know it today, and what made Marxism so effective in the real world, so different from everything that came before it. Marxism is a large word and it encompasses so much, but Foster identifies the 8 core features of Marxism in his essay Major Principles of Marxist Socialism, taken from this section in one of the most concise essays on the topic to this very day. These core features of Marxism create a progressive increase in our body of knowledge on the study of society and its progress. You've probably guessed by now that we're going to be detailing those 8 features here, right? If so, give yourself a high five. You nailed it. So let's get started, shall we? Section 1, Philosophical Materialism. All science rests on the fundamental idea that the material world is primary, and that our ideas are a reflection of that objective reality. Materialism says that we do not pluck ideas out of the ether and shape the world as we see fit, operating on a proverbial blank slate, but instead that the world shapes us, that our actions are based on the way we interpret this reality and on what is possible within that reality. Karl Marx was the supreme philosopher of materialism in his day, the original taker of the red pill. He based himself fully in this understanding and counterposed it against what he considered the idealist imaginings of others, such as Hegel, Hume, Kant, and Berkeley, whose philosophical systems all led, though one route or another, to the acceptance of some type of world creation. For philosophical idealists, it is not the material world that is primary, but the idea. A great thinker or powerful leader would poof an idea out of the ether and then put this idea into practice. For Hegel, the entirety of world history was the formation of ultimate truth through the continual process of making more precise the idea. Marx, instead, proposed a world ruled by definite laws and showed us how understanding these laws would lead to a greater understanding of the world itself. Not only that, Marx also showed us in his various works how the idealist outlook on the world constitutes a shield for the capitalist class, and how materialism could be, as Foster called it, the sharpest intellectual weapon of the proletariat in its fight against capitalism and for socialism. Section 2. Dialectics. Dialectics is a scary-sounding word, almost as scary as Bigfoot. But once we understand what it means, it turns out it isn't that scary at all. Really, dialectics is the study of motion, the motion of all things and how that motion happens. Lenin once described it as the theory of evolution, which is most comprehensive, rich in content, and profound. But that's a little jargony and dated. Let's put it into ordinary human language, another great phrase from Lenin, so we can wrap our brains around it. What did Lenin mean when he said this? What is dialectics? What are the nuts and bolts?
Motion is the mode of existence of matter. Friedrich Engels.
When we study the motion of something, the first thing we usually want to understand is what causes that motion, right? If we want to know how a car moves, we need to understand that it has an engine and a gas pedal and all the other parts that work in interconnection that make it move. Dialectics is like learning how a car moves, but for the entire universe and everything in it. Every phenomenon has internal forces that produce its motion. When we look under the hood, so to speak, we discover that there are mutually interdependent forces that struggle against each other inside any given phenomenon. The study of the molecules inside water that push against each other in order to create its evaporating or freezing point could be said to be a dialectical study of water. In this same manner, the study of the struggle between capitalists and workers is a dialectical study of society. Without dialectics, our materialist foundation is incomplete, since it is impossible to truly understand a phenomenon without understanding the core foundation of that phenomenon, its motion, the way it develops and deteriorates. The two form, one could say, an interdependent concept. Without understanding what's under the surface, we have, well, only the surface. We can say that society is full of people who do work, but dialectics and materialism give us the tools that help us understand why those people do this work and why they do it the way they do. Section 3. The materialist conception of history. It was Marx and Engels who first put the study of history on a scientific footing, tearing to shreds the old metaphysical and subjective ways of writing history in much the same manner as an electric shredder tears documents apart at the Citigroup offices. Through extensive, exhaustive, and often exhausting explanation, using their dialectical materialist methodology, Marx and Engels peel back coincidence and trace all of the myriad phenomena in society to their source, to the one central root cause of why things in society happen the way they do. In Marxism, we often refer to this as the economic factor, or the way production is carried out within a given society, or simply the way people make their living. Marx said on this,
In the social production which men carry on, they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but, on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness.
This neatly sums up one of the major discoveries of Marxism, the economic factor as the basis of the motion of society, which we commonly refer to as the base. This puts all the rest of it into motion and builds what we call the superstructure upon it, our political systems, laws, spirituality, and everything else. Let's break that open and make sure we're all on the same page before we move on, though, shall we? Since it is precisely the opposite way to look at it from the one we are taught by default. What does it mean to say that people, Marx uses men, but this is 2022 here, okay, enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will? Well, people are forced to work with and create relationships with each other in order to engage in production, right? It really doesn't matter what we want. What matters is that we are forced to do this in order to function in society. If you are a working class person, you must go out and sell your ability to perform work to someone who owns the property, which makes production possible. If you're a capitalist, you must buy that ability to perform work from workers. Without this relationship between worker and owner, capitalist production doesn't happen. There are many levels of this, and sometimes these days the capitalists themselves are mostly removed from the process, instead buying the labor power of some people in order to do that for them, but it still all boils down to this essential relationship. Okay, that was easy. How about the next part? These relationships correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. Don't worry, this one's easy too. In order to analyze society's motion, Marxism breaks the progress of history up into stages. I like to picture it like a timeline in my head, and each part can be divided up into stages as we see fit in order to more easily analyze the motion. Each of these stages was created by a great leap in the technology related to production and served to advance society. The advent of the slave societies, sometimes called antiquity in bourgeois universities, which came after what we often refer to as primitive communism or pre-class society, for example, was based on the invention of agriculture. Planting crops and domesticating animals rather than hunting and gathering was a completely new way human beings were engaged in production, a new form of society. We, as a species, needed to eat, and as we grew, needed to eat more and more. So we hunted and gathered more and in better and better, more efficient ways, making the production of that era more efficient. This created a surplus and then a need to own our new surplus. Likewise, the invention of factory assembly, coal, and steam power represented the beginning of capitalism. Each of these class relationships, master and slave in the early era of class society, owner and worker in capitalism, correspond to the level of technological development of the human race. All of that innovation based on what's most economically efficient, that's what comes first. It lays the basis from which everything else in society rises. The way we go about organizing our society, our legal and political structures, that all stems from how we look at the material conditions we find ourselves in. We don't have class without some people owning and some people working, after all. Marx was pointing out the dialectical progression of phenomena in society. A heady concept for sure, but one we can break apart and learn, as we see here. He ends the statement with a very good quotable line that really just sums it all up. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but, on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Marx is saying that the form our society takes has a material basis in the economic factor. Back into ordinary human language, he's explaining that the way we go about producing, the mode of production, and the objective relationships this causes is what determines what our social, political, and spiritual lives look like. It isn't good ideas producing good things or bad ideas producing bad things. It is the material reality that produces good ideas and bad ideas, and even how we look at those ideas. The social relationships we create in order to, well, create, those come first. That affects how we think about things. And as we get more advanced, new ideas manifest. This quote has led a lot of people who don't really take the time to understand what it means, a lot of them due to their class interests, as class is a large determining factor in the kind of social consciousness people have, to launch an accusation of economic determinism at Marx and Marxism, saying that Marxism states that only the economic factor is important and dictates everything that happens, as if people don't have free will or work against their own class interests. But this is a misunderstanding and seems like it forgot to read the last part of Marx's quote here. Engels addressed these detractors directly, saying,
According to the materialist conception of history, the determining element in history is ultimately the production and reproduction in real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. If, therefore, somebody twists this into the statement that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms it into a meaningless, abstract, and absurd phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various factors of the superstructure, the political forms of the class struggles and its results, constitutions, etc., established by victorious classes after hard-won battles, legal forms, and even the reflexes of all these real struggles in the brain of the participants, political, jural, philosophical theories, religious conceptions, and their further development into systematic dogmas. All these exercise an influence upon the course of historical struggles, and in many cases determine for the most part their form.
what he means is that the source of what happens is the economic factor, but the things it creates, these matter too, and affect the course of historical events. For example, because race and racism were created to serve capital does not mean that racism itself has not played a large role in the development of American society, or that it is not a large part of the general class struggle in this society. When we engage with the study of history using Marxism, we see that the old bourgeois way is simply not enough to genuinely understand the real cause of things. In fact, it tends to outright ignore the true cause of events throughout history, laying emphasis instead on all sorts of secondary or superficial elements, on great ideas of great men or evil ideas of evil men. Overall, a bourgeois history lesson is often a random jumbling together of dates and deeds, battles and warriors, with very little, if ever, talk on the root cause of these battles and warriors, on the economic factor pushing these forces into motion. It can often pretend at this but fail in every respect. Case in point, the reason often given for the beginning of the first great imperialist world war is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is all well and good. It was a very early battle in this war, possibly the first skirmish. But why did it happen? What were the underlying factors that caused this event? These are the questions Marxism answers. If bourgeois history has no real, clear understanding of the past, then how can they possibly understand what is happening in the present? Historical materialism, however, the term we give to the dialectical materialist methodology applied to history, and its emphasis on the economic factor gives Marxism what Foster called a decisive advantage in drawing the elementary lessons from past history, and for understanding the fundamental meaning of the complex economic and political processes of today. It's this study that leads Marxists to the conclusion that economic revolution, those leaps in technology we talked about, leads to social revolution. Changing conditions create an inability to live in the old way as well as new ideas, which leads to political organization and political revolution. People are thrust into motion to do what they must to continue society, and that is a complete transformation of the basic characteristics of society into a new form, which leads us to the conclusion that socialism, the stage of development after capitalism, is inevitable. This may sound very strange at first glance, but as we learn the scientific basis and understanding of this, it naturally becomes clearer and clearer, especially when we learn how this happens over and over again throughout history, in different forms corresponding to the material levels of production of society. Section 4. The Class Struggle. Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto,
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones.
Marx's description of this process of class struggle is a description of the processes happening throughout history, compelling the motion of society. He is applying the dialectical materialist methodology to society, putting the study of its motion of the conflicting forces making history happen onto a scientific footing. This helps us understand all of the internal laws of motion of society, but it is up to us to put them into practice. Without Marxism, this is a confusing jumble of events, but armed with our scientific method, we can understand the forces at work that produce different events throughout history. The economic factor, again, is the central root of everything. The direct relationships people must enter into in order for society to function separates us into mutually interdependent and contradictory classes. In order for one class to fulfill what is in its material interests, it needs to directly harm the material interests of the opposing class. If a corporation, a group of capitalists recognized by the state, decides to shut down its factories in one location and move them to another one where it is able to pay workers less, this directly harms the material interests of the workers there. Likewise, when a factory organizes into a union in order to win higher wages, this harms the material interests of the capitalists. Marxism gives us the tools we need to understand this on a systemic level, to understand what our material interests as a class are. We see the opposing class, what Marx called the bourgeoisie, everywhere trying to obscure this fact, to obscure class and blur even what the term means, which can easily result in us accidentally siding with its interests against our own. Marxism doesn't just give us the tools we need to understand history properly, but also to fight against that obscuring and to work towards what's best for us instead. Marx was incredibly modest about this significant scientific discovery. In a letter to American Marxist Joseph Weidemeyer in 1852, he said that he deserved no real credit for discovering the existence of classes in modern society, or even the struggle between the opposing classes. Bourgeois academics had already begun pecking around the edges of class and production before Marx began his work. He explained the important parts of his work as having three essential parts. First, that the existence of classes corresponds to particular historic phases in the development of production. Second, that the class struggle necessarily leads to what he referred to as the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the working class organized as the ruling class of society, and its interests dictating what happens in society, according to the laws of societal development. And third, that this new form of state only constitutes the transition to the abolition of class itself, and to a classless society, as the material interests of the working class necessitate working towards the end of classes altogether. There are many labels given to this and many misrepresentations of it, based on not quite understanding the way Marx and Engels thought, what it was they were doing. In our modern society, we refer to this period after capitalism as socialism. Through all of this, if we look at this the way Marx did, we see that he was studying society's motion, its progress, and discovering the forces that made that progress happen. Class struggle, the dialectical struggle between the two opposing and interdependent forces within the phenomenon of society. As Foster took care to note, Marx was being incredibly modest in this letter. Marx and Engels created a methodology that would let us clearly see not just what is here now, but how we got to here, and in so doing, gave us the guide we need to continue progressing society and fight for a better world for the working class, for the masses, for us. Section 5. The revolutionary role of the working class. The word class has become rather murky in modern American society. What is a class? Our pundits and bourgeois academics talk of the middle class quite frequently, or of the political class or professional managerial class. These can have some sort of merit in our Marxist analysis, but overall, the establishment tells us to measure what we call class in terms of income level. The more money one has, the higher their class. This is not the terminology Marx and Engels used, and not how Marxists view class, how we separate groups of people when analyzing society and its motion. We do this, like all things, by our dialectical materialist methodology. We get to the root of things, to the economic factor, and discover that the best way to group people is according to their material interests, which lies in the social relationships created by how they relate to production. It is that relationship to production that defines what class a given group is in Marxism. Once we learn the fundamentals, it's important to recognize how the distortions of the capitalist class serve their class interests by distorting how people view themselves and production itself, individualizing it. But that's a subject for another time. It's common knowledge that Marxism focuses on the working class, a group of people whose relationship to the means of production, the way they go about living and being part of society, is their lack of ownership and ability to accumulate, forcing them to sell their capacity to perform labor, a special commodity Marx calls labor power, to those who own the means of production. But Marx and Engels did not study the working class arbitrarily or because they suffered at the hands of the ruling class, or because they wanted everything to be fair for everyone and the working class were large and represented the masses. In fact, the peasantry was larger in many regions of the world in their day, and had a completely different relationship to the means of production, one left over from the feudal era, as capitalism was becoming the dominant force in society. It was their special position as the developing class of society and material interests as the working class that made Marx and Engels focus on this class. It was, and is to this day, in the material interests of the working class to overcome class altogether, to create the productive forces and relationships of production necessary for class itself to no longer have a reason for existing. Every dollar the workers get, the bosses see that as a dollar they lose after all. This constant back-and-forth struggle would best serve the working class by overcoming it altogether and eliminating the capitalist from the equation, while the bosses, on the other hand, rely on the working class to actually produce value for them. Other classes faded with the passage of history and the development of capitalism. In Marx's day, the small shopkeepers, artisans, and small manufacturers all stood opposed to the bourgeoisie, but for a different reason than the working class. Their class interests were in preserving their positions, making them conservative in the true sense of the word. And as capitalism progressed, became reactionary, meaning their class interests were better served in the previous stages of society. The working class, however, is produced and grows according to capitalism's advance, and is therefore the class in the position to be the nascent or developing end of the contradiction at the heart of society's progress. The only truly revolutionary class of the period of history in which capitalism is the dominant stage of development. Due to its position and material interests, remember the Marxist focus on the economic factor, the leading role of the working class, the constructive class to build our future, has been present in successful revolutions to get past capitalism all over the world, in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, etc., and working classes all over the world take it upon themselves to organize and bring this about. Lenin elaborated on this phenomenon very thoroughly, but it was Karl Marx who first began laying the groundwork for this addition. In the Communist Manifesto, he wrote of the type of, as Foster called it, thinking, fighting, disciplined party necessary for the working class to win finally over the capitalist class.
The communists are on the one hand, practically, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties in every country. That section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement.
So, what did he mean by this? At first glance, it sounds a little egotistical, but that is not the way Marx viewed the world. He saw this as a scientist, and in order to understand what he meant, so must we. Marxism shows us that the dominant ideology and way of viewing things in any society is the ideology its ruling class. That ruling class was able to spread this way of thinking throughout that society, but it is important to look at this fact dialectically, to analyze it in its motion. Because it is dominant now does not mean it is invincible, but precisely the opposite. It means it has developed already and is now undeveloping. The time this takes to happen and the way it happens are governed by the phenomena mentioned above, by class struggle and its own development. Section 6. Surplus value. We often hear Karl Marx's 3-volume work Capital referred to as his magnum opus. Before Marx, the great bourgeois economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo wrote on this period of history and contributed greatly to our understanding of capitalism, value, and commodity production. They were operating in the time before Marxism, however, before the world outlook and methodology of Marxism was able to give greater clarity to the study of society and how it functions. These days, the bourgeois economists, in their increasing desperation to provide excuses, have degenerated into little more than con men, making apologies for capitalism, rather than genuinely examining its functions. Capital was Marx's great work on this subject. Taking his new world outlook and methodology, he was able to describe the process of society and its motion, and specifically capitalist society, in a way never before possible. He explained the process of what led to capitalism, which he deemed primitive accumulation, the causes of the crises, panics, recessions, crashes, capitalism experiences every 4 to 10 years like clockwork, and the continual concentration of capital in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists. One of the greatest discoveries elaborated in this book was what Marx spent decades studying. What is value? Where does it originate? Marx's elaboration of what he deemed surplus value, the value that capitalists derive from commodity sales that is not paid to the workers for their creation or used to maintain their means of production. This discovery exposed the capitalists for what they were, parasites. And this surplus value being the property of the capitalist class is the central element of the opposing interest between worker and owner, why the working class is the truly revolutionary class according to Marxism. Since then, countless bourgeois academics have tried to refute Marx's great work on this subject. None have succeeded. Section 7. The role of the state. This is beginning to feel a little like a Marx's greatest hits list, isn't it? Coming in at number 7, it's, drumroll, the role of the state. Give it a hand, everybody. Okay, bad jokes behind us. Let's continue on. Marx and Engels dedicated quite a bit of study to the question of this thing called the state. What it is, how it developed, what its concrete manifestations are, things of that nature. While the bourgeois academics would hold that the phenomenon of the state developed spontaneously due to the good ideas of good men, only men, and stood above society, concerning itself with the welfare of all of the people, Marx and Engels showed that the state, like all things, goes through a process of development and undevelopment due to the internal contradictions within it, based on the economic factor that the state takes different forms according to which class is the dominant class in society, and is the tool of the dominant class of society for the repression of the other classes. They showed that with the progress of the working class state, the continual advance of the productive forces and motion of society, the state itself will eventually begin to wither away and undevelop, once the conditions for its existence, class struggle, are no longer a factor, replaced simply by the routine administration of things. Section 8. Class struggle and the tactics of the working class. Marx and Engels did more than that, though. They also began understanding the forms of struggle and tactics the working class takes in its continual struggle against the bourgeoisie. William Z. Foster details quite a lot of their correspondence and actions within the International Workingmen's Association, or First International, in his book History of the Three Internationals, which represented the first real organization of the working class in its own interests. The letters between the two detail their original ideas on this issue and are a fantastic read for communist nerds, even to this day. Before their work in showing the world the exploitative nature of capitalism or organizing workers themselves, they proved how the nascent class of society always organizes itself and overthrows the moribund class, showing how only the proletariat were in a position, once organized and educated, to lead the entire toiling masses towards socialism. They did not, however, sit around dreaming up ideas for ideal worlds, as the utopian socialists that came before them did. Instead, they relied on cold, hard science to guide the way, instead developing what is often referred to as a guide to action. Of the many distortions and misconceptions about Marxism going around today, the idea that this was what Marx and Engels did is one of the most prevalent. If life were a football game, this distortion would have us believe that Marx and Engels wrote out a playbook. And their criticism is that we cannot expect some playbook written for a football team 200 years ago to work on our team now, with totally different players, rules, and conditions. Or sometimes they argue that we should follow this imaginary playbook they believe was written. But Marx and Engels and company did not write a playbook for us. Of course, they were interested in a playbook for their specific team and created this, but their main discovery was the creation of the language playbooks are written in. They developed all the X's and O's and little arrows you see in football movies when the coach is explaining the trick play to the team that's had a rough first half, so they can win the game at the very end. This language is the essence of Marxism. And each socialism that arises develops its own playbook from this language. And each socialist project wins the game with their own unique plays, written specifically for their own conditions, their own unique time and place. Learning dialectical materialism and historical materialism, learning how to think like a Marxist and then apply that to our actions in the real world, is the first step in building socialism.